Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Pinkelman, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. The brown bags have been offered since the mid-1980s, with a couple of exceptions some years ago. The brown bag topics for the year are not thematic. However, in light of Nebraska's 150th celebration of statehood, the Society will sponsor the brown bags for 2017 related to the theme, Peoples of Nebraska. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in the auditorium at the Nebraska History Museum at Centennial Mall North and P Street in Lincoln. The programs have a live audience and are broadcasted on public access channels in Lincoln, Omaha, Bellevue, Hastings, North Platte, Grand Island, Papillion, South Sioux City, Blair, Bassett, Chadron, Sidney, and Beatrice, and are also posted on YouTube. A detailed schedule of this series, as well as information about all the Society's programs and services, can be found on the Society's website at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not already a member, I encourage you to join. Benefits of membership include subscriptions to the Nebraska History Magazine and the Society's newsletter, use of microfilm reader printer in the Society's library archives to make free copies for microfilm, free admission to the Society's 7 historic sites, and discounts at Society's landmark stores at the History Museum, the State Capitol, and Chimney Rock. Reduced fees at kids' classes, tours, after-hours events, and similar activities where there are fees. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society's Foundation for the financial support, which allows us to tape and broadcast programs on public access television across the state and on the Society's YouTube page. To find these videos on YouTube, directions for our live audience are on today's handout. For those viewing on the video, the directions are on the screen. It's easy. Type in your browser www.youtube.com/user/Nebraska Historical. Click on the playlist and you will go to a new page. There you will see a list labeled 2017, a subsection to house this special sesquicentennial brown bag series, Peoples of Nebraska. Just below the subsection, you will see a subsection labeled Brown Bag Lectures, where you will find over 150 past brown bags available on YouTube. Our speakers today are Lissette, Aliaga-Linares, and Thomas Sanchez. Dr. Lissette Aliaga-Linares is an associate professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, a senior research associate at the Center for Public Affairs Research, and the faculty member at the Office for Latino and Latin American Studies at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. She holds a PhD in sociology and demography from the University of Texas in Austin. Born and raised in Lima, Peru, Dr. Aliaga came to the U.S. in 2003 as an international student. Since 2013, she moved to Omaha and has authored many reports on the socio-demographic trends of Nebraska Latino population and Latino-owned businesses. Dr. Thomas Sanchez is an associate professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and a faculty member of the Office of Latino Latin American Studies at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Born and raised in Scotts Bluff, Nebraska, Dr. Sanchez has researched ethnic identity formations and incorporations of Latino immigrants at 2 new destinations across the state, such as the city of Schuyler. His most recent research project focuses on the experience of DACA students in Nebraska. Their topic is Nebraskenos, how Latino generations continue building belonging to the good life state. Just to let you know about questions, they prefer you wait till the end. Please join me in welcoming Lissette and Thomas.
Thank you for inviting us today. I'm going to start with a little warning. I am the demographer here, so part of my talk will be a lot of numbers. But I think I find numbers interesting because behind the numbers there is always a story. So Tomas here, Dr. Sanchez, he's the one that is going to tell you much more about those stories, those interesting stories behind the numbers. So let me start with a question today. And this is, if we want to talk about Latinos in Nebraska or Hispanic and Latinos, we're going to use that term interchangeably here. How far back in history we should go?
The beginning of the state territory.
Yeah, great. I mean, this is actually, I give this talk before, and the responses that I got from the audience was actually 1990s. So, I mean, I have a much more informed audience today, which is great. Okay, so if we actually go back to the data, I found that if you consult the U.S. Census Bureau estimates, the historical estimates, printed estimates, you will not find any estimates until 1940s. But you have to understand that before there was not such a thing as an Hispanic, you know? So many of the data that we can find prior to those years are basically approximations. And the University of Minnesota, through the IPONS project, actually conducted a resampling of the regional census data and categorized people that were either their birthplace was in a Spanish-speaking country. And they found that as early as 1870s, we can count Hispanics in Nebraska. Actually, they counted 112 individuals whose birthplace was in Mexico. And since then, I will say that kind of the story, at least by the numbers, starts, you know. And just by in the 1900s, these 112 became 367 Latinos or Hispanics in the state. And these 367, actually, the highest proportion were people born in the state, were not immigrants. So to put these numbers into perspective, actually, if we think about what happened in the 1980s, I mean, like this is a population that have a long history in the state, and since the 1990s, we have most of half of the foreign-born population in Nebraska is actually Hispanic. That's part of the visibility. But if we put these numbers into context, actually, we will see that immigration is not new to Nebraska. It's not new to the U.S. And back then, in the early 1900s, actually, we have a peak year of when the quarter of the population in Nebraska was foreign-born. So since this recent wave that is mostly composed by immigrants from Latin America, you know, actually we had only the foreign-born population has not been the largest in the history of Nebraska and has not been the largest even in proportions, because it has been steady since then between 6 or 7% of the whole population. So while the experience of immigration inevitable shape our communities, it is important to note that this is only the start and the restart of our story of Latinos and Nebraskenos, you know. The trajectory is what counts the most. And that is what those immigrants and their US-born offspring have done or are still doing to build belonging in this state. Actually, that's the meat of the story. So I use here the term Nebraskenos to talk about Latinos in Nebraska. And this is substantiated in one particular fact. While initially many immigrants from Mexico came to work seasonally, many of them became settlers in this state. They became Nebraskenos by choice. And while they settled, they raised an even a larger generation of Nebraskenos by birth. Most of the US-born Hispanic population was actually born in the state. It is only in 2 census years that the number of immigrants were larger than those born in the United States. Those census years were 1910 and 1920. And since 1930, actually, this situation started to change. Part of the invisibility of this story, though, is because this story was very localized. And here to tell you more about that context, I introduce you to Thomas Sanchez, born and raised in Scottsbluff, Nebraska.
That's right. So yes, welcome everybody. And yes, I was not only born and raised in Nebraska, but I've lived in many parts of the state and seen almost all of it. I lived in Scottsbluff till I was 18 and then did dissertation research, and then lived in Lincoln, going to school for 10 years, and then lived in Schuyler for 2 years, doing my dissertation research, and then I've lived in Omaha since 2000. So I've lived in many different parts of the states and many different communities. But one of the things that I want to talk about with early, Lissette talked about, Dr. Aliaga-Linares talked about it being localized. And so what I'm going to talk about initially is really Scottsbluff. First of all, and she kind of said this, but I want to reiterate it, that most of these people we're talking about are Mexican origin. They're either born in Mexico or their ancestors, their parents, in this case, were Mexican. The concept and the term Latino, Hispanic did not exist yet. So there was probably a handful of Cubans and some other nationalities, but almost all of them were Mexican. Some of these ties that I have are rumored ties, right? So I'm still trying to hunt down the specifics to get some of the proof. But one of them was, so we have the Mexican Revolution in 1911 to 1917, depending on who you ask. And a lot of people fleeing violence from the Mexican Revolution came to the United States, and some of them apparently came to Nebraska, right? So one of the rumors is that Pancho Villa's sister, there was a man, an Anglo man from the town of Homer, Nebraska, that went to Mexico to fight with Pancho Villa in 1915, right? This was kind of the height of Pancho Villa's armies in Mexico. Pancho Villa's sister, after the war, came back to Homer, Nebraska, and lived out her life in Homer, Nebraska. Again, this hasn't been substantiated, but this is one of these ties. Another tie, also related directly to the Mexican Revolution, has to do with a gentleman now deceased that lived in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, Robert Huerta. And it was rumored that Robert Huerta's uncle left Scottsbluff in 1915 to go fight again with Pancho Villa's army. Now, Robert Huerta is deceased, and I still am trying to hunt down some of the evidence of these purported ties. Just on a little bit of a personal note, my grandfather came not to Nebraska yet, but came from Mexico to Texas in 1914. He was 9 years old. So we see a lot of that migration, people fleeing the violence of the Mexican Revolution. Now, things that have been substantiated, right? In 1921, the Catholic Church sent a minister, a priest to minister to the congregation, the specifically Mexican congregation in Scottsbluff. And we know the Catholic Church is not going to send a priest to this place if there's not already a community established, right? They're just not going to do that. So I've looked over here at the State Historical Society. I've looked through the newspapers, through what used to be known as the Scottsbluff Republican. And I haven't found any, I've got up to 1918. I haven't found any mention of Mexican immigrants per se, which is interesting because there is mention of German immigrants. This was World War I, so there was a story that I read about this German farmer that from Bayard, which is near Scottsbluff, that the people of the community had to come out and kind of vouch for this guy because they were going to deport him or send him to prison. They had to say, no, this guy's an okay guy. I did find evidence of, for example, violence against African Americans. In this case, they used the term Negro. A Negro was hung in Wyoming right across the border. But so far, I haven't found any evidence of in the newspaper of really Mexicans being there. However, again, we know that they were there. The years that I've heard was about 1912, 1914, 1915. But again, the Catholic Church is not going to send a priest there before 1921 if there's not already a community established there, a Mexican community established there.
The 1930s.
Oh, okay. I thought that was there. So one of the things that happened in the 1930s was there was mass deportations of Mexicans. Francisco Valderrama and Raymond Rodriguez released a book in 1995 called Decade of Betrayal. And the idea was that it was, so the Depression was going, and the idea was that if we deport all these Mexicans It'll free up jobs for Americans. Does this sound familiar? Right? I mean, we have these same kind of things playing over again today. So they went and rounded up. Now the estimate is 500,000 to 1 million people. And when I present this information, usually to students, they always say, well, how come they don't know? Is it 500,000 or is it 1 million? Because they didn't keep records. They literally went into communities, rounded people up, and sent them back to Mexico. Now, again, an estimate was that 60% of those people deported were children, and they were children who were citizens, children who were born in the United States, but their parents were deported, so they were deported also. And again, there's no record, so the estimate of 60% really can't be substantiated. This really devastated communities. Not only were these mass numbers of people being rounded up and deported, but the leaders of the community were being deported. The intelligentsia of the community was being deported. The people that would become, eventually, if they had not been deported, run for office and become leaders of labor unions and teachers and farmers and those kinds of things were deported. So again, I hear kind of echoes, a little bit different in scope, but echoes of DACA in terms of deporting large numbers of people who have high levels of education and who can kind of forge the future of, not the Latino future of Nebraska, but the future of Nebraska, period. One of the things that we do know is that in Omaha in the 1930s, and we know this because Dr. Maria Arbeláez has done research on this, so they're getting ready to construct Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish in Omaha. There's also Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish in Scotts Bluff, but that came much later. But that construction was delayed by at least a decade because all these people were deported and there wasn't enough parishioners then to finish the construction of the church. So this was, again, this mass deportation. It happened mostly in the Southwest, but it happened in Nebraska also, as we see illustrated by this church construction being slowed down because people were being deported and there wasn't enough people to minister to there.
So, since the 1940s, actually, migration in Nebraska increased only slightly, and it's around the 1970s with the Bracero program. Actually, Nebraska entered late to the Bracero program, and there was not such a need of immigrant labor anymore. So it didn't had a big spike in terms of immigration during those years. But also, 1970s is an interesting year for demographers. And this is because this is the first time that the census counts Hispanics, that term was introduced. And when it was introduced, it was just in a sample of the surveys. And it was, like right now we fill a short survey, which has like the basic demographic information, and then some households are sampled with a long form. So if you think about it, Hispanics were not even included in the question in the short form. It was in a sample of the sample long form. So you have a severe undercount of this population in the United States. So people that have corrected this estimate, actually in the Census Bureau, is used as a proxy the Spanish mother tongue. And for the state of Nebraska, these counts come at around 21,000 people that will trace their heritage to a Spanish-speaking, country. But interesting, if you think about it, if the first wave of immigrants were largely male laborers, it will be less likely that you have a mom that speaks Spanish and will be like a Spanish mother tongue, the way you will imply that that's your heritage. And by that standard, actually, Tomás Sanchez here will not be counted as Hispanic. Again, even with this particular undercount, I would say this is a very important part of the history on Nebraska, because this is like the start of what we will call the second generation, these young people that were born and raised here and were doing things in the state. Actually, I have some numbers for you about, in terms of how these communities started to spread. So you see, by the end of this period, 1940s to 1980s, we still have a very localized population. So we have only one place actually had more than 20% of, actually between 10 and 20%, it was 12% to be exact. Scotts Bluff had 12% of their population being Hispanic. And most of the counties in the state have less than 2.5. Actually, the norm of 2% of the Hispanic, of the population in Nebraska being Hispanic was, again, a very localized story. But this is important because this is the time when there was a generational change. And if you see my graph, in one side I am displaying the age groups of the Hispanic population in Nebraska. In orange you have the foreign-born population, and in blue the US-born population. And you see that the immigrant population, again, is a young population, so most of the people is concentrated around the 20s years of age. But if you look farther up, it seems like the all generation is almost divided 50-50 in terms of the elder population. So this elder generation is aging, and you have a new momentum, much more bluer part of the graph in the younger generation. And this is a younger generation that grew up in terms with a lot of constraints too. Actually, if we think about averages, 81% of the Hispanic immigrants at that time didn't have a high school diploma. Yes, in general, back then, educational attainment for adults was lower, but that will mean, to make the comparison clear, at that time in the state of Nebraska, only 26% of the total population had not completed high school. So you see how the difference that it makes, a gap of almost 55% points. 12% of the youth, actually, in Nebraska, though, was attending college. And these numbers actually doubled. From 1975, there were like 700 college students that were Hispanic descent, and in 1980s, it became 1,400. So similar to the trends that we observe, that we're going to observe right now, like a higher proportion of population with no high school diploma, but it's still younger generation, like trying to attend college. Also, you have other additional issues. 21% of the Mexican households that were the most that were counted at that time were and they're below the poverty line. That's another issue about this. But the important thing, though, is that within these constraints, this generation left landmarks in the state. And to talk to you more about that fun part is Tom Sanchez again. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things Lissette, she started in 1970, and I'm going to go back there, but I remember seeing some census data recently that said in 1980, Hispanics made up 1.2% of the population in the state of Nebraska. And as you see from the map, coming from Scotts Bluff, that just shocked me. It surprised me, right? Because there had been Mexicans in Scotts Bluff and Mexican Americans for a long period of time. One of the things I'm going to talk about it really started in the 60s, but took hold across the nation in Nebraska is the Chicano Movement, right? A civil rights movement modeled on and similar to the civil rights movement that the African Americans did more in the eastern part of the country. The Chicano movement was alive and well in Nebraska throughout the 70s. It was concentrated mostly in Scotts Bluff and in Omaha. There were some parts in Omaha. And in fact, there was a strong tie between the two. There's still people that are Chicano movement veterans that live mostly in Omaha. I remember as a young child seeing graffiti on the walls that said "Viva Ramon Perez" or "Viva Leroy Casados." These were people who were active in the Chicano movement. I remember one time in it must have been 75 or 76, there was a school walkout, right? And so all the Mexican American and Chicano, I was in grade school, and all these students are walking out. My mother would not let us walk out, right? She's like, no, you're staying in school. You're not participating in it. I don't know that it was necessarily animus towards the Chicano movement or that term Chicano per se, but it was just more that you got to stay in school because it's important. we see, again, that Chicano movement in Scottsbluff and in Omaha. And part of the legacy we see here on the slide here, the legacy in Omaha. And I say legacy because these things began with the Chicano movement, but they're still around today. So we have in Omaha now, it's starting to become massive, the One World Health Clinic. And they have, I don't know, 4 or 5 or 6 different satellites, places around Omaha, and they're growing. It seems like every time I turn around, they're adding another place. And there's a health clinic that serves low-income people. It started off as the Indian Chicano Health Center in the early 70s. I'm not sure exactly the year, 1970 or 71. And so there you have that Chicano. Over here you see on the right, upper right of this picture, the Chicano Awareness Center. I remember even in the 80s, but certainly in the 70s in Lincoln at UNL, the Mexican American Student Association having Chicano Awareness Days. So you have the Chicano Awareness Center, Chicano Awareness Days. So at this point, it wasn't a matter of, it was celebrations, but it was really a matter of making people aware that this population even existed, right? And by aware, I think their awareness is geared towards Mexican Americans and non-Mexican Americans in terms of kind of this awakening. The Chicano Awareness Center that you see here eventually became, it was fairly recently, I want to say 7 or 8 years ago, the Latino Center of the Midlands. So not only were these things happening nationwide, where we were going from kind of the radicalness of the identity term Chicano to something that people didn't feel as nervous about, Latino or Hispanic. And when I say people feeling nervous about it, I'm not talking about non-Mexican Americans or non-Chicanos. I'm talking about people like my mother, people like my parents, right? If we look at the Chicano movement, it was loud, but it was a minority of the people in that group. Even if other people supported them morally, they weren't going to the marches and they weren't, participating in those kinds of things. So we see this kind of shift from the radicalism of the Chicano movement to Hispanic. I use Latino. There's different people go back and forth between Hispanic and Latino. We use them interchangeably here. Part of that is geographic. I saw a poll the other day that said I think it was 60 or 70% of this group of people prefer Hispanic over Latino. The poll was in Hispanic Business Magazine, so it kind of makes sense to me that they would skew towards Hispanic and not Latino.
So now we're moving to the 1990s, actually, the time when some of people from earlier audiences have thought that this is the beginning, but it's actually the rejuvenation of Nebraskenos, I will say. So this is the time when immigrant Latinos increased by the 6-fold in the state. It went from 6,000 foreign-born Hispanic or Latinos in the state to 36,000. And actually 40% of these new immigrants were coming directly from abroad. And that was kind of unusual because before, most of the people would come to the States through Texas. They would start looking work in Texas, go through the railroad and get into the Omaha, know a little bit that the sugar beet industry was, hiring laborers, and they would go to Scottsbluff and things like that. But they never came with a fixed idea of coming to Nebraska. Actually, they came through other gateway states, So this was unprecedented part in Nebraska. We have 40% people coming directly from abroad, and most of them come from Mexico. But again, during this time, from the 1990s to the 2000s, and we're going to see it more pronounced later, there were other groups that were also coming. I didn't talk about Cubans that much, but actually there was an increase in Cubans during the 1960s and 70s, and this is due to the situation back in Cuba. But we have more diversity than we used to have before. So actually this time is the time that we have from localized stories, that the stories became to spread out. So initially, again, we have 2% of the Nebraska population being Hispanic or Latino, and most of these Douglas County was the most populous one. Scottsbluff was the one with the largest share of Hispanic population. But you can start like seeing the growth from 1990s to 2000s to be higher in other counties. Actually, in the 2000, we have Nebraskenos grew to represent 6% of the population in Nebraska. And in 3 counties, you can count that there were more than 20% of the local populations. To tell us more about what happened in the 1990s that may explain these widespread stories, again, I call Tom.
Yeah, so again, kind of moving around geographically through the state, one of the places that I have done some research, and I lived for 2 years, was Schuyler. Schuyler, Nebraska, I'll use the census term, the Hispanic population of Schuyler, Nebraska grew 1,377% from 1990 to 2000. So in 1990, the official census had about 168 Hispanics, and all but 10 or 12 were from Mexico, the rest were from Guatemala. In 2000, Schuyler grew from 4,000 people to 5,000 people from 1990 to 2000. In 2000, it was officially 43%. Right now, I know the demographers like to rely on census data, but I know that this was an undercount because the Head Start program there was 100% Hispanic. The grade school was about 80%, and then as you moved on up to the high school, it got lower and lower there. But if the grade school is 80% Hispanic, my guess is that the community is going to be more than 43% Hispanic. The population grew there. Well, and the other thing that happened at that time was it went from being, it's still mostly Mexican, but there are other groups. I think now it's about 80% Mexican. Dr. Aliaga-Linares might get into this. But there's increasingly people from Guatemala and El Salvador coming to Nebraska for jobs, right? I mean, anybody that knows things about Schuyler, there's a packing plant there, and leaving Central America because of wars and other kinds of things that are happening in the place they're coming from. The issues with Schuyler and Lexington and South Sioux City and Scottsbluff to a lot lesser degree have to do with technological changes, so that we moved from the meatpacking industry moved from shipping cattle to a place like Omaha and Chicago to doing it more locally because of refrigeration, and because they could then in touring the Schuyler plant, they called it the disassembly line. They could disassemble the cow and put it in boxes and ship it directly to stores, so the stores didn't have to cut up more of that, a side or a quarter of that beef. So when I did my research in Schuyler, I found, my guess was in this small town that you would have a true Hispanic Latino identity because the town was so small, as opposed to, maybe like Chicago, where you have a Puerto Rican neighborhood and a Cuban neighborhood and a Mexican neighborhood. And one of the things I found was that there was this kind of Hispanic Latino identity, this community, for lack of better words, I'm going to oversimplify it here, but this kind of darker, this brown Spanish-speaking community as opposed to the white English-speaking community. And they identified in that way. However, when you broke it down, when you asked them about specifics, they went back to the national origins, right? For various reasons, including, when they came, and a lot of it had to do with, now not everybody worked at the packing plant, but a lot of them did. So a lot of it had to do with the hierarchy at the packing plant, where the Mexicans were being promoted more to the foreman and to the managerial positions, and the Guatemalans and the Salvadorans were not. Now I mentioned Guatemalans and Salvadorans because that was the second and third largest group behind Mexicans. There was, and probably still are, people in Schuyler from almost every Latin American country. I remember counting people from Peru and Ecuador and Cuba, and not another country, but another place, Puerto Rico. So there was a large population there. I oftentimes wonder if there's even today really this Hispanic or Latino identity. And I know in my generation there's not, but I see it in the younger generation. I see it in the terms that they use. that they don't say I'm Salvadoran or I'm Guatemalan, and they even kind of vaguely know about that background and that history. They talk about being Latina or Latino or Hispanic. And so while I'm still a little bit cautious in terms of saying, does this identity really hold in terms of this broad group of people, I think the younger generations are starting to make that identity a reality in terms of how they live their lives every day, in terms of the culture that they live in, everything to do with relationships, family relationships, religion, food, music, all those kinds of things are becoming more homogenous in terms of that Latino Hispanic identity as opposed to the national identities that they used to claim.
So a lot of the conditions where these counties grew were based on the relocation of meatpacking plants, and I think we can talk about that. But if we think about what happened after 2001, actually we can divide kind of the evolution of the Latino population growth in the state in two stages, roughly marked around the impact of the recession, So starting, you see a decline from 2001 to 2002. And this is nothing to do with Nebraska in itself, but has to do with the impact of September 11, generally nationwide, decrease the number of incoming immigrants with tougher regulations for not only for non-immigrant visas, but also to controls at the border and things like that. And the momentum too, of what happened in New York. So we have an initial decline from 2001 to 2002 of immigrants in the state, but for the most part, up to 2005 and 2006, the Latino immigrant population actually increased very fast pace in the state. So compared at least to 2007. So we know that nationwide, since 2010, that net migration from Mexico dropped to zero. Now we have a different flow of immigrants coming, particularly much more pronounced from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Central America, as Tom mentioned before. So after 2007, we have that the immigration from Nebraska have started to slow down. Again, if we compare the rates for Nebraska and for other states that were not typical traditional destination, we'll see that the gains are much larger than in California or in Texas for sure. But again, this is mostly due to a shifting patterns of settlement, let's say. Actually, 80% of the people that come from Nebraska, Latino, Hispanics, foreign Latinos and Hispanic that come from Nebraska, are coming from other states. And the most important feeders are California and Texas. And in over the last 5 years, actually, you have seen an increase on people that are coming from Arizona or other places. Part of the attractive is the affordability of Nebraska, against other, more crowded, much more, more expensive places to live. So using our demographic lenses, we can, what happened here? Nothing. Oh, well, there was a mishap in this slide, actually. It's not showing everything. But if we use our demographic lenses, we can explain growth in two chunks, actually. We can count the amount of people that are moving and the amount of people to move out, which is the net migration. And this only accounts for 25% of the growth of the Nebraska Hispanic population in the last 5 years. Actually, what is counting more for the difference is what we call natural increase, which is the differences between births and deaths in the state. So is this because Latinos have larger families? That would be the question. And interesting enough, yes, it's only partially true. The general fertility rate is higher for non-Hispanic, for Hispanic women for sure compared to non-Hispanic whites. But yet over the years, this fertility has been declining in the state. And right now, actually, it's even lower, a bit lower than the one from African Americans. So you see that even though there is declining fertility and a slowdown in immigration, you still see a significant contribution of the births, like to Hispanic women, making up a larger proportion of the state. So actually, and peak years was 14%, but the late estimate is 14% in 2013. But you see that, again, there is a slowdown in fertility. So what explains this? So what explains this is actually, even if you have declining fertility and there is a slowdown in immigration, the population still grows because there is an inherent younger age structure. And this younger age structure of the Latino population is the key that explains the growth. So there are more people that is young, so more people will reach reproductive ages, and there will be much room for growth. But this population have an important component, and you see, if you compare these two, we are talking about the linkages between an immigrant population that are concentrated in those reproductive ages, like the parents, and this younger generation of young Latinos. And this is my second question that I have asked before. So what is for you the typical portrait of Latinos in Nebraska? If I want you to represent a typical Nebraskeño, how it will be? Who will it be? Are you picturing a man? Are you picturing a woman? Are you picturing somebody in their 30s, their 40s? Uh-huh.
I would guess, because of the packing plants, it would be men and about 30 to 40 years old, but that's a guess.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the typical image that comes to mind. But actually, the immigrant population only makes that 35%, you know? And you're right, like still most of the occupational categories, most Latino working in meatpacking plants. But even though our median age is much younger than that, and if you want to represent a typical case as the most repetitive case, actually the teenage boy that goes to middle school and goes to high school is the typical face of the Nebraskeño right now. And this Nebraskeño is very linked to this immigration story, because 2/3 of the population under 18 in the state have either a parent that is foreign-born or two parents that are foreign-born. So you see the linkages here of this new wave with the younger Nebraskeños, which is the majority right now of the Nebraskeños in the state. So, and this, if we think about just the immigrant population in Nebraska, this also comes with their own challenges. So, again, we have, for instance, that still there is a higher proportion of foreign-born adults of Hispanic descent that had less than high school, 63% in the state. And in the state overall, this goes as low as 9%, you know? So the gap is still similar, you know? Latino immigrants continue to be employed in those low-pay occupations, and poverty has increased over the years for the Latino Hispanic population in Nebraska. But there are many other more stories to be told in here, you know? Again, I think that now it's safe to say that there is no county in the state where you don't find a Latino, or where Latinos represent 0% of the share of the population. So we have even 6 counties now whose shares are larger than 20%, you know? And again, to put some numbers into the diversity of origin, again, it seems to be still very high in the sense of this Mexican, you know, origin population. But from 1990, this percentage have decreased. In 1990, it was 80%, and now has declined to 72%. We have an increasing presence of Nebraskenos for different origins in Central America. We have Cuban that has actually peaked in Grand Island. Puerto Ricans, and even South Americans, for which Colombians are the bigger share. So in this new context, there is much more to say and much more room to grow. And to talk about this diversity and what it implies in terms of the leadership is Tom Sanchez here.
So, yeah, so I want to take just a one step back, and you can leave the PowerPoint where it is, but I just want to give a couple numbers on age, right? If we look at the median age, and the median is not the average, the median's, the age that 50% are older, 50% are younger. The median age nationally in 2011 was 37, okay? For white Americans, it was 43. Now, I'm not going to give you all the different groups because we don't have a slide and I don't want to confuse you, but for Hispanics, it was 28, right? And so this goes along with Dr. Aliaga-Linares is saying that about reproduction, right? I mean, who's going to have more children? Someone that's around 28 years old or someone that's around 43 years old, right? I mean, that's pretty easy there. One of there's a number of challenges that we have looking to the future, and I kind of put it on two sides of the spectrum. One of the challenges is the education, right? On the young side of things, we have a much younger population and people that are going to be going to school and are in school. We know that nationally, younger than 5 years old, that population is already the white population of that group is below 50%. It's barely below 50%, but it's below 50%, and Nebraska is similar in that. So we have issues with education, right? Who are going to be the teachers, and what kind of education are we going to give people? On the other side of things, on the older side of things, we have things like Social Security and taxes. So if we have this much younger Latino population, and I'm talking about Nebraska mostly, not nationwide, although it mirrors the nation also. We have the people that are going to be working, that are paying into Social Security, are going to be largely Latino and African American, and of course there's going to be a large number of white individuals there also. But this is something that we need to look at in the future and plan for. Who's going to pay the income tax? Income taxes in order to keep the country rolling, but Social Security taxes for what's really going to be, and again, I'm oversimplifying this, but largely an older white population and a younger Hispanic Latino population. So here we see, some of the institutions. We have the state senator here, Tony Vargas, who is actually the second Hispanic state senator. The first one was Ray Aguilar. He was appointed and then won election one time after that. And then also we see here a number of DACA recipients, and then also the picture on the it should be your left. On the bottom is DACA recipients. The picture on the top is graduates of UNO in the graduates of OYAS, of the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies.
And what I want to comment, and maybe because it's the only way I can talk you about a Peruvian here, beyond me, is that you see this leadership is very diverse. You have Tony Vargas is a Peruvian American. The people working in the Harlem Workers Center, you have, actually he's from Guatemala, Sergio Sosa. People in Justice of Our Neighbors are Argentinians, he's an Argentinian leader. And you have even, like, our director now is from Chile, but our previous director was from Venezuela. So you have a much more diverse leadership from the Latino community too. And the big challenge ahead, though, is how we can get this momentum of the second generation, that is this teenage boy that is going to high school, and it could take up the new generation of the leadership and to keep doing and building belonging in this state, like putting all these marks that makes us visible here and that makes us, this a good place to have a good life. And the other message that I wanted to come up to you is that because of this demographic shift, one thing that will happen, inevitably happen, is that Latinos will shape the future of Nebraska. And this is, there is an aging population, a majority population is aging, so the populations that have this younger age structure will fuel the growth of the state. And if we go to the numbers, and these are projections that the Center for Public Affairs Research, CEPAR, has done at UNO, actually we will see that overall, Hispanics will make, back in 2050, will make like a quarter of the population in Nebraska. And non-Hispanics white will decrease in presence. It will not be necessarily majority, minority, it still will be the majority, but it will tend to decrease over time. We see this shift already happening, and this shift will come much more visible in the younger ages. So if we see, and this is 2010, what is it, 2010, you see more people in the younger age structures. Then you will go in 2013 even much younger, And if you go even, people in the older generation will have increasing presence of Hispanics too. And if we want to see this in terms of the numbers, actually, what would that mean? You have 30% of the population being Hispanic at the school age. You will have almost a quarter of the population being at working age. And even 14% will be at retirement age. So we'll have much more things to be part of. And 22% will be a voting age and eligible to vote, if we think in terms of the U.S. born population that will be Hispanic. There are some promising trends if we think about this current situation. We see, for instance, more Latino, the high school dropout rate for Latino, this new Latino generation have been continued to decline in the state. College enrollment continues to increase. At UNO, every year is the same news, like record high number of students of Hispanic descent. Teenage pregnancy rates in the state has also declined for Latinos. And the number of Hispanic-owned businesses have doubled. And now are more than just restaurants or things like that. Actually, they are even in real estate, in other kind of professional service, have diversified in terms of the presence of Hispanic businesses. But there are some challenges ahead, and one of the challenges is the fact that with increasing poverty, we have Latino growing in more households that are more exposed to poverty. We have also one advantage that Nebraska had is like the ownership rates for Hispanics compared nationwide was pretty high in Nebraska. So it was much more likely that you can buy a house, be a homeowner in Nebraska. But that affordability, at least since the recession, have started to decline. So actually it went from 48% to 47% of Latinos being homeowners. And the share of the pay in terms of the rent actually has increased, which actually is questioning affordability too. Other trend that is worrisome is the increase of single-headed households. And this is, we cannot trace why single-headed households, whether people divorce or not, but we can see that this is a direct impact on deportations, And a single-headed household is, single mother or single father is nothing to be bad in itself, but it's a household that is more exposed to poverty because it's counting from one income, only one source of income. Also, unemployment rates have continued to increase despite the fact that Nebraska have the lowest unemployment rates nationwide, So there are some challenges ahead in terms of what is for the Latino population here. And to close, I want to invite Tom.
Yeah, so just a little kind of reiteration. UNO is projected to be what's called a Hispanic serving institution, which means more than 25% of the population to be Hispanic. Not in 10 years, but in the next 5 or 6 years. And the biggest feeder school for UNO is now Omaha South. It used to be Omaha Central, but it's Omaha South, which is it's a very diverse school, but I don't know if I think it's over 50% Hispanic. So those are some big changes that are coming. So one of the things we wanted to kind of leave here is that it's really not a glass ceiling, right? In terms of one person breaking through, it's really more of a sticky door. And we see that, we have glass ceilings, and glass ceilings get broken, but if only one person gets through there oftentimes is a backlash. And we see this with presidential politics, right? We have the first not just the first African American, but the first non-white president being elected, and then there comes the backlash, and well, we know what happened. So we have, generations and large groups of people that really need to, the sticky door needs to be unhinged or just broken through, with large numbers of people. And I say this I say this as a Latino myself, but the thing that we're talking about here is the future of the state of Nebraska, period, not just the future of Latinos in Nebraska. So that's what we have, and I think we'll take some questions, if you have any.
Gracias.
Yes, thank you. There was a hand here and then one over here.
I spent some of my youth, my family were what I would characterize as military nomads. But we were in the Omaha area on and off over the decades. And I remember South Omaha in the 1960s, the population in South Omaha were Bohemians and Polish and Italian, and a lot of them packing plant workers. And I see the explosive growth of the Hispanic community in Omaha. What was the driver there?
Well, so you're absolutely correct, and that South Omaha was a very diverse. So one of the question was that what drove the Hispanic growth in South Omaha, because it had been previously a very mix of European backgrounds, and Mexicans were there, but they were just one of the other groups that you talked about, the Czechs and the Germans and the Italians and the Poles, and they were all grouped, and the Mexicans were there. Meatpacking is one of the things that brought people to Omaha, as they brought them to Lexington, as people were brought to Schuyler. Last I had checked, now we'll have to look with the demographer here. South Omaha, by any estimation, including city council district or legislative district, is not majority Hispanic, contrary to what a lot of people believe. It is the plurality there, so it's the largest group, but it's not over 50%, even to this day. But yeah, it was jobs for the most part, but a lot of those jobs were in meat packing. And that growth has been very recent. I moved to Omaha in 2000, and so you have this corridor, anybody familiar with Omaha, on 24th Street, that is now a very, Latino or Hispanic themed, corridor. It's not like makes it sound like an amusement park, right? but all the businesses there are Latino businesses. But when I moved in 2000, that wasn't true. There was a lot of Latino businesses there, but they weren't all Latino, and there was still, those holdovers from the European immigration, the Prague Hotel, the Bohemian cafes, not on South 24th Street, it's over on 13th, but all those places were still there. Even if they weren't open, the buildings and the names were still there. Anything to add on that?
I mean, it's the same reason. It was jobs. But the thing is that, again, like you see, that was a story, a localized story. Omaha is bigger. It's very big. So in terms of the share, it didn't showcase as much. It didn't make 2% of the total Omaha metropolitan area population. But actually, even today, if we want to just separate Hispanic population by location, actually half of the Hispanic population is living in Omaha, in Nebraska. So Nebraska, Omaha is a very important center, I would say, of reference for the Latino community.
Thank you.
Thank you.